Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Kurten, and today I will be exploring the conflict that has arisen in the Chesapeake Bay over time, which is a prime example of how so many people are affected by these water systems that they often do not think twice about, or even wonder if there are any threats being posed to these watersheds. Up to this point in the class, when we have been reading The Death and Life of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan, we were introduced to the many threats that the Great Lakes have been exposed to. While these were shocking and concerning to read about, it can still be hard as individuals to fully invest ourselves into an issue that doesn't directly impact us, as the Great Lakes are a handful of hours away, and we do not get our drinking water from there. But we may need to take heed of the dangers expressed in some of these chapters, as the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, which covers a great portion of the state of Pennsylvania, has also been subjected to these dangers. And these problems can be attributed to some of the issues we even read about previously, which is why it is so vital to be aware of these things. To first understand the problem that I will present to you about this watershed, it is important that we first define and understand how grand the scale is of the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. Starting all the way back with how it was created, Richard Albright notes that buried hundreds of feet beneath the Chesapeake Bay lies the sixth largest known crater on Earth, a crater created by a 2-mile wide meteorite that slammed into the Atlantic Ocean 35 million years ago. And after glaciers melted and global warming increased, the rest of the area was carved out for the bay, and the expanse that it covers is massive, as it stretches out into 7 main areas, which include New York, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Pennsylvania. In fact, as the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection notes, half of the land area of Pennsylvania drains to the Chesapeake Bay from 4 major river basins, and Pennsylvania comprises 35% of the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed, which proves that it covers a major part of the state we all reside in, so much so that we encompass over a third of it. As you can see in this diagram, the Chesapeake Bay actually branches off into numerous rivers in PA that are all interconnected, which consist of the Juniata River and the entirety of the Susquehanna River, including its western branch. Some of us may live very close to these rivers, but may not even know the turmoil they and the entire bay have faced over the past handful of decades. Like many other natural and vital sources of water, humanity in its greed and thoughtlessness have destroyed the Chesapeake Bay over time, as excess amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment from human activities and land development, including agriculture, urban and suburban runoff, wastewater discharge, and air pollution, are sent to the bay, states the Committee on the Evaluation of Chesapeake Bay Program Implementation for Nutrient Reduction. And they go on to add that these pollutants and other chemical and physical alterations have disrupted the ecosystem, causing degraded habitats and harmful algal blooms that impact the survival of fish, shellfish, and other aquatic life. This is important because the water that is affected will harm even local waterways, drinking water, water that would be used for farming, and much more. Algae buildups can be extremely detrimental to us as everyday people as well, because when major blooms occur and even the water treatment systems cannot mitigate them properly, we will have a crisis on our hands. Now, while the massive amounts of nitrogen going into this watershed can mostly be attributed to the oxygen in the air itself, the story is different for elements such as phosphorus, which can be directly linked back to farmers. This happens when rainfall hits the fields and the fertilizer that is laid throughout the farm fields is collected and runs off, eventually depositing into the Chesapeake Bay, which can have detrimental effects on building up these unwanted algal blooms. This scenario should be very reminiscent to you all of the Chapter 7 reading in Dan Egan's book, where he touched on an identical conflict arising near Lake Erie, where farmers and the products they used on their fields were setting off a chain reaction of harm for the body of water. But not much could be done, as the laws didn't necessarily prohibit them from doing this, and there was a severe lack of government funding to actually inspire any change on an individual scale for the farmers. In fact, writers such as Arlene Walters bring attention to the point that currently few federal regulations govern the environmental impacts from agriculture, and that some environmental laws specifically exempt agriculture from regulatory requirements, and others are structured that agriculture is not addressed by most, if not all, of the regulatory impact, which is a huge issue, and the Clean Water Act and other laws that avoid bringing the impact farming has on polluting waters nationally need revisions immediately. Farmers aren't the only threat that contribute to the pollution of the watershed, though, as the military also had a lot of direct influence on this delicate system in a very dangerous and damaging way. Another huge factor in the bay's decline and rapid destruction over the past few decades was in part from the irresponsible actions of the military and the tests they were conducting at the time. Albright makes it known in his book Death of the Chesapeake, A History of the Military's Role in Polluting the Bay, that an estimated 20 million artillery rounds and other munitions left over from testing were on the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay and other places. And there were also numerous tests of bombs, mines, targeted missiles, torpedoes, and such that are obviously not ideal for the lake and let off a lot of harmful chemicals into the estuary. As a matter of fact, there are many contaminants identified as being related to the military munitions that were just stranded in the lake, which included trinitroluene, high melting explosive, white phosphorus, royal demolition explosive, and more, with very detrimental health effects if one were to be exposed to them, such as nervous system damage for HMX, skin burns, and reproductive effects for white phosphorus, and with trinitroluene being a possible carcinogen for humans. And it doesn't stop there either, as even apart from the military itself, government regulations allowed for the dumping of nuclear waste in the bay and other areas, which polluted the drinking water of the District of Columbia heavily with strontium-90, which can be linked to events in 1960, where 317 tons of unidentified radioactive waste was dumped off Shintotig, and was followed in the years to come by dumps also in the hundreds of tons, which is unbelievable, truly, how this was even considered to be allowed. While we often think about how these affected waters will impact human populations depending on the water, we should not ignore the ecosystems themselves with their intricate connections and massive amounts of organisms whose health is put at risk by this human carelessness, which often killed off very vital components of the food chain in this watershed, such as the Eastern oyster. But because over time we realized that the change needed to be acted upon, we turned to the idea of reintroducing these crucial species into the lakes as a start, once it was safer to do so. We as humans have certainly made a drastic and horrendous impact to the Chesapeake Bay, as it is reported that the poor condition that it was in back in its prime led us to notice that all types of organisms in the bay showed signs of stress, and that the submerged aquatic vegetation reached an all-time low due to the water quality being so lackluster, and the reduced exposure to light on the plant surfaces due to algal blooms, as Sarah J. Gottlieb brings to the forefront. Additionally, because of nutrient pollution, dredging, toxic dumping, and much more, the entire ecosystems were offset once the oysters, which proved to play a pivotal role in controlling the amount of phytoplankton in the bay and giving nutrients to the bottom of the water, were effectively wiped out. Because the flourishing plankton, with no regulator to stop them from multiplying out of control, can offset a water's pH balance, all the aquatic life will suffer, and the entire food web will hurt due to this. So over time, as our efforts to clean up the water have begun to come in full force, introducing the Eastern oyster was a step that proved to be necessary to help the bay return to normalcy, as it served as a filter feeder and mitigator of the base of the entire food chain in the ecosystem, serving as a keystone, which is needed for anything to be complete and have a better, less fallible structure. While this was a strategy that truly helped on the recovery of the Chesapeake watershed, there were also other techniques and strategies that should be recognized as being significant as well. Besides adding the oysters back to the Chesapeake, there are various other actions that organizations and biologists are either planning on putting into action to improve and preserve the bay's condition or actually doing. One of the main elements that is being pursued to keep the bay in a safe state for all of us is implementing provisions to deal with the agriculture runoffs. And Arlene Walters says that the goal of non-point source pollution is to induce farmers who cause water quality damages through their production and management decisions to adopt pollution prevention and control measures that are consistent with societal goals, and that policymakers can consider a range of policy instruments to accomplish this, from purely voluntary to regulatory, but also ensuring they target the farmers who contribute disproportionately to the problem rather than the farmers who have a limited and acceptable amount of runoff, though they still should be mindful of the chemicals they are using. Another strategy they are using for the Chesapeake situation is adaptive management, which, if you remember from Chapter 9 of Dan Egan's book, was defined by Lana Polak as the process to start paying attention to the changes that have already happened, learn everything you can to better predict changes likely to come, and to be strategic in your decisions of how to cope, which is what the Chesapeake Bay program is heavily interested in. One last strategy that I found that I was heavily interested in is the efforts that the organizations such as the EPA and CBP are planning on in cutting down on the phosphorus in animals and their wastes. And it is noted that a reduction in the quantity of nitrogen and phosphorus excreted by livestock can be accomplished by supplementing livestock diets with enzymes to enhance digestion, such as phytase, and that these enzymes reduce the need for phosphorus supplements in feed and potentially reduce the total phosphorus content in manure, which is an area that can be realistically targeted and improved upon to also help the bay out and let it recover from these damaging chemicals that would otherwise be pouring into the watershed. This entire situation with the Chesapeake Bay Watershed serves as a reminder of the severe and harmful impacts humans have on the environment around us, whether it be polluting in the air or in feeding populous and unwanted algae in our waters. And some are taking notice of this and letting it serve as a warning of what we all should avoid in the future. In the fall and recovery of the bay itself, many other areas around the nation have taken notice, and instead of ignoring the threats that could eventually be posed to them, rather use it as a learning moment and take into consideration what they can do on their end to prevent the destruction of their ecosystem. A great example of a body of water that adapted lessons from the Chesapeake Bay situation was Lake Champlain, which is found in the states of New York and Vermont. As David K. Mears makes clear, while there are many distinct differences between Lake Champlain and the Chesapeake Bay, such as the lake being freshwater and the bay is saltwater, differing shapes and proportions, and more, the two watersheds do, however, share a common set of environmental and legal challenges, with anthropogenic activities proving to be a great sign of danger for the bodies of water, and that the categories of pollution that pose the most significant problems are the same: polluted runoff from agriculture and developed land, discharges from municipal and industrial wastewater treatment plants, and erosion from unstable stream banks and beds. But because of this shared pollution, they can both have similar tactics when it comes to approaching and tackling the conflict. So Lake Champlain has taken notice of the base program known as the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, in conserving the waters and limiting the amount of pollution regulated into the water. As the EPA itself has noted that TMDL is a historic and comprehensive pollution diet to restore clean water in the Chesapeake Bay and the region's streams, creeks, and rivers, which give Champlain a good sense of how they can limit their own pollution and how to avoid reaching critical phosphorus intake and doing their all to prohibit the downfall of the watershed. Lake Champlain has set a wonderful example of how other territories with fragile bodies of water should react to the Chesapeake Bay scenario, and instead of being apathetic and hoping that it doesn't happen to them, to rather inspire change while they still have the chance to preserve these systems of water that prove to be so important in our lives. Fortunately, the Chesapeake Bay is in a much healthier state today than it has been for many, many years. But this should not indicate that it's time to give up, but rather the opposite. Evan Lubowski puts it perfectly when he says, "The Chesapeake Bay is a poster child for environmental degradation. The largest estuary in the United States, the Chesapeake Bay catches the runoff from one of the country's oldest farming districts. It has been barraged by decades of nutrient runoff from urban and agricultural waste. But the Chesapeake Bay is also the poster child for large-scale restoration efforts. As the bay's health and economy tanked throughout the past century, concerned people rallied to save it. The public and governmental support in cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay is nothing short of commendable, and it truly does show the power of public awareness and support for a noble cause, which is how the Chesapeake Bay program has done such amazing things, which include important and swift efforts to clean up the air, reintroduce the critical oysters, improving water treatment plants and processes, educating those who are uninformed, and monitoring and general restoring of this vital water system. This is all fantastic news, of course, but this is no sign to just acknowledge and then not do your part as well. Actually, you can do quite a lot on the individual level to help important rivers such as the Susquehanna on a daily basis, as Mike Argento for the York Daily Record writes. And this can consist of scooping your dog's poop and not letting it sit out in the yard to become harmful bacteria captured by rainfall, making calls to your legislators, avoiding littering, and, as he directly notes, to use less fertilizer, or stop using it entirely, because it may be the case that everyone wants to have a nice, lush lawn. But commercial fertilizers contain nitrogen and phosphorus, major sources of pollution to the river watershed and the bay, which proves that it is not worth the adverse costs on the ecosystem. I want to conclude on this note, as it leaves a more optimistic tone to the not so stellar recent history of the Chesapeake Bay, but to also call you all, and myself, to action in preserving this watershed which we rely on for so many basic necessities in our lives, such as drinking water and in the food that we eat, which needed various crops to make and water to grow them. Here is a slide with my references list quickly. And lastly, I wanted to thank you all for your attention, and I hope you learned something of value from this presentation.